Beneath the glittering chaos of Hollywood scandal sheets and short-lived love affairs lies a quieter, more compelling story. One about the women who stood firm while the cameras rolled and the temptations multiplied. These were not women who made headlines. They made something harder to come by: lasting devotion. We're pulling back the velvet rope on 9 remarkable women whose faith ran deeper than any script ever written. And before we begin, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and frankly, it's far less confusing than programming your television remote. 1. Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball. He came to America with almost nothing. His father had once been the mayor of Santiago, Cuba, but revolution has a way of stripping titles and fortunes down to rubble. Desi Arnaz arrived in Miami as a teenager, carrying $2 and a guitar. He made his way to New York, found a conga drum, and played his way into the spotlight. She was from Jamestown, New York, a girl who had spent the better part of her youth and young adulthood chasing a stardom that kept sliding just out of reach. They found each other in 1940 and married, though the ceremony was civil and therefore, in the eyes of Desi's deeply Catholic mother, essentially decorative. She was not impressed. She was not satisfied, and in 1949, she got her way. Desi and Lucille stood together at Our Lady of the Valley Catholic Church in Canoga Park, California, and made it official the way his family's faith required. Lucille Ball, brash and brilliant and thoroughly non-Catholic, took those vows in a church that wasn't hers, for a man she loved and a tradition she respected enough to honor. What came next rewrote the history of American entertainment. Desilu Productions, I Love Lucy, which became the most watched television program of its era, Star Trek, Mission Impossible. They built a genuine empire, assembled from talent, stubbornness, creative friction, and for the years it held together each other. The marriage collapsed in 1960. The professional legacy never did. She kept running Desilu. He kept creating. Desi Arnaz was buried from St. James Roman Catholic Church in San Diego County in 1986. Through every upheaval, the celebrity, the wreckage, the alcohol, the slow grief of losing what they had constructed together, his faith never left him. She called him Babalu. He called her Lucy. Neither one ever quite became the other. That may have been the magic of what they built, and it may also be why it eventually broke. Both things, as with most things worth examining, are probably true at once. 2. Martin Sheen and Janet Templeton, his given name, is Ramon Antonio Gerardo Estevez. The industry told him it wouldn't sell, so he borrowed a stage name and went to work. What the industry could not borrow, change, or market away was who he actually was beneath it. Martin Sheen was born in Dayton, Ohio in 1940, the 7th of 10 children raised by a Spanish immigrant father and an Irish Catholic mother. He grew up working class, deeply Catholic, and politically restless in ways that only intensified as the decades passed. He has been arrested more than 60 times in acts of nonviolent protest. He gave away his entire salary from Gandhi to charitable causes. He is, in the same breath, one of the most recognized screen presences of his generation, and a man who has spent a career making himself a deliberate inconvenience to those in power. He married Janet Templeton on December 23, 1961. He was 21. She was 20. Neither of them had money. He was chasing an acting career. She was, by most accounts, chasing him. Janet Templeton is a devout Catholic, and she has described faith not as a private comfort, but as the organizing architecture of everything they built together. Sheen's own Catholicism grew deeper through her, through the decades of difficulty that followed, through the heart attack that nearly killed him on the set of Apocalypse Now in 1979, through his long public struggle with alcoholism, through the specific and unrelenting anguish of watching their son Charlie's life come apart at a distance too close to look away from. Through more than 60 years of all of it, Janet has been present, not on talk show sofas, not in breathless magazine profiles, not managing a social media presence, simply there, in the way that a woman of genuine faith is there, without fanfare, without seeking credit, without wavering. Sheen has called her his anchor, and a word carries real weight. An anchor doesn't just hold steady, it prevents you from being carried somewhere you cannot return from. Together, the family made The Way, a film about the ancient pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela, directed by their son Emilio. Starring Martin, produced by Janet, a Catholic film built by a Catholic family, sent into the world as an act of shared belief. In Hollywood, where belief is usually something you perform for an audience, that is nearly everything. 3. George Burns and Gracie Allen. George Burns was a product of the Lower East Side. His father was Orthodox Jewish. Burns himself, as he freely admitted to anyone who asked, had long since stopped keeping faith in any organized sense. "I don't believe in the hereafter," he once told a reporter with characteristic bluntness. "If I don't make them laugh here, I'm not going to make them laugh anywhere else." Gracie Allen was an Irish Catholic girl from San Francisco, raised in a family where performing wasn't ambition, it was simply what you did. Her people had been dancing on stages since she was 3 years old. She and Burns met in 1922 at the Hill Street Theater in Newark. He was attempting to be a comedian without notable success. She walked out onto that stage and somehow he became funny. All of a sudden, Burns said later, the audience realized I had a talent. They were right. I did have a talent, and I was married to her for 38 years. It took him 4 years of nightly proposals to get her to say yes. She was engaged to someone else when they met. He was patient in the way a man is patient when he understands that the alternative, a life without her, is simply not something he can accept. They married in Cleveland on January 7, 1926. When they eventually adopted children, they went through a Catholic agency on the condition that the children be raised in Gracie's faith. Burns agreed without hesitation. He had walked away from religious observance long before Gracie entered his life. But Gracie's faith was not a policy position. It was part of who she was. And who she was had always been the entire foundation of everything they built together. Gracie suffered from devastating migraines for much of their marriage and developed serious heart problems in her later years. She retired from performing in 1958. She died in 1964. When the time came, Burns found himself facing a problem that was, in its own way, a love story. He was Jewish. She was Catholic. No burial ground belonging to either tradition could hold them both. In the practical, unsentimental way that defined him, he found a solution. Gracie's funeral was held at All Saints Episcopal Church in Beverly Hills, not Catholic, not Jewish, specifically so that George could one day lie beside her. They chose Forest Lawn Memorial Park, an interfaith cemetery. The stone reads simply, "Together again." Burns lived to 100. He never remarried. When he was finally laid to rest beside Gracie in 1996, he had already arranged, well in advance, that she receive the upper crypt. He wanted her to have top billing. That was his religion. It always had been. Her four, Gary Cooper and Veronica Balf on screen. Gary Cooper embodied something Americans wanted desperately to believe in, the man of few words and total moral clarity, standing alone against the crowd because he understood in his bones what was right. Off-screen, he was considerably more complicated. His infidelities were not discreet footnotes in his biography. By his own family's reckoning and the historical record, they were a defining pattern of his adult life. Marlene Dietrich, Patricia Neal. Others, he was reckless and rarely careful about it. His wife knew. Veronica Balf, known to everyone as Rocky, a nickname earned as California's women's skeet shooting champion, was a Catholic. Born into East Coast society, educated with a kind of quiet discipline that doesn't need to announce itself. She brought to the marriage something Cooper had no real framework to understand, a faith that was not performed for an audience. She attended Mass. She raised their daughter Maria in the church. She did not deliver ultimatums. She did not leave. They married on December 15, 1933. Cooper, at the time, had no particular religious affiliation and treated Christmas and Easter Mass roughly the way a man treats someone else's obligation, present but not quite there. Rocky kept going, week after week, year after year, without argument and without announcement. In 1953, the Cooper family traveled to Rome and were granted an audience with Pope Pius VI. Cooper later described the experience as unexpectedly moving. Something had shifted. He began attending Mass more regularly, discovered a priest named Father Harold Ford, whose sermons actually made him think, and their daughter Maria recalled that her father nicknamed him, with genuine affection, Father Tough Stuff. In April of 1959, Gary Cooper was baptized into the Catholic Church. Less than 2 years later, he was dead of prostate cancer at 60 years old. Rocky sat beside him. She later said that what helped him most, at the end, was his faith. From his deathbed, Cooper told those gathered around him, "I know that what is happening is God's will. I am not afraid of the future." He died on May 13, 1961, the same calendar date, 50 years earlier, on which the Virgin Mary had first appeared at Fatima. Rocky had never demanded his conversion. She had simply, steadily, continued being who she was. In the end, the man who had spent 30 years playing conviction on camera finally found it in his own life, quietly, late, and beside the woman who had never lost it. 5. Alfred Hitchcock and Alma Reville, the most technically commanding director in the history of cinema, harbored exactly 3 documented fears: the police, eggs, and falling short of his wife's expectations. Alfred Hitchcock was born Catholic in London in 1899, shaped by Jesuit schooling, and marked by a faith that never fully released its grip on him, even across the decades he spent looking the other way. The guilt that pulses through his films, the innocent man condemned, the false accusation, the moral weight that cannot be shed, was not an artistic affectation. It was the residue of a religious education that had a precise and unforgiving vocabulary for sin. But this chapter is not about Hitchcock's faith. It is about Alma Reville's. When the two met in the early 1920s at British famous players Lasky's studio, Hitchcock was working as a title designer, and Alma was already his professional superior. a seasoned film editor and script consultant whose creative instincts he trusted above all others. The proposal, as the story has it, came on a boat crossing the Irish Sea during a particularly punishing storm. Alma was too seasick to formulate a coherent refusal. They married on December 2, 1926, at the Brompton Oratory in London, one of England's most magnificently ornate Catholic churches. Before the ceremony, Alma converted from Protestantism to Catholicism. The record suggests the conversion was strongly encouraged by Hitchcock's mother. What matters is not the circumstances, but the fact she was baptized, confirmed, and married in the Catholic Church. For 54 years, Alma was Hitchcock's unacknowledged creative engine. She read every script. She caught continuity errors invisible to everyone else. When she watched the rough cut of Psycho and noticed that Janet Leigh's eyes moved, that a dead woman was visibly still alive, Hitchcock went back and recut the scene. Her eye was the final word. In his last years, 2 Jesuit priests visited Hitchcock regularly at his Bel Air home. One of them, Father Mark Henninger, later wrote about watching the man who made Vertigo and the Birds receive Holy Communion, weakened by age and illness, weeping quietly before his God. The woman who had sharpened every frame of his greatest work, who had converted to enter his faith and his world, outlived him by 2 years. She died in 1982. He had shared everything with her. He had listened to no one else. 6. Bing Crosby and Kathryn Grant Bing Crosby wore his Catholicism the way he wore everything else, comfortably, visibly, without apology. He attended Gonzaga University, a Jesuit school. He played Father O'Malley twice on screen and nearly turned the role down, genuinely worried he might embarrass the church. His fictional priest became one of the most beloved figures in American Catholic cultural memory. His first marriage to actress Dixie Lee in 1930 was a proper Catholic ceremony. It was also, over time, a quiet catastrophe. Dixie Lee struggled with alcoholism. Crosby was perpetually absent, managing baseball teams and racehorses and real estate. Their 4 sons inherited the wreckage. One of them, Gary, eventually published a memoir about his father that held nothing back. Dixie Lee died of ovarian cancer in 1952. Kathryn Grant was 20 years old, from West Columbia, Texas, a beauty pageant runner-up turned Paramount contract player, and she was rushing through a studio lot in 1953, carrying petticoats to wardrobe, when a 50-year-old man smiled and said, "Howdy, Tex," that was Crosby. She was Methodist. He was Catholic. He made his expectations clear early. Conversion was part of what marriage to him would require. She made her own expectations equally clear. She intended to keep her career. He eventually agreed to the first condition and quietly reversed himself on the second, preferring she step back from the screen as he moved toward winding down. She ultimately accepted the arrangement, but the conversion, she has always insisted, was hers, something she chose for herself. The moment it became real for her happened in Paris. She attended Christmas Mass at Sacre-Cœur, couldn't follow a word of the Latin, and found it overwhelming anyway. She came home to Texas and enrolled in 6 weeks of religious instruction. The priest suggested she slow down. She told him he had no authority to keep her out. He didn't. They married in October 1957 at St. Anne's Catholic Church in Las Vegas. She was 23. He was 54. They had 3 children and remained devoted to each other until his death in October 1977. After he was gone, Kathryn spent 4 decades protecting his legacy, co-writing memoirs, organizing golf tournaments in his name, raising their children in the faith she had claimed as her own, not entirely for him, and not entirely apart from him either. "You can't keep me out," she had told the priest. She never left. 7. Neil McDonough and Rube Robertson. In 2010, Neil McDonough was dismissed from a network television series called Scoundrels 3 days after production began. The network issued a statement about a casting change. McDonough has told a different story. Consistently, across a decade of interviews, he refused to perform a sex scene, and that refusal cost him the job. After that, "I couldn't get work," he said. "Everybody decided I was some kind of religious zealot." He had grown up in Dorchester, Massachusetts, attending Sunday Mass with his father. Not as an obligation to be discharged, but as something genuine, a connection between the two of them in the quiet hours before the rest of the world stirred. He became Catholic not because it was required of him, but because it was where something true resided. He met Rube Robertson in 2000 while filming Band of Brothers in England. She was a South African model. They married on December 1, 2003. From the beginning of his career, McDonough had built a contractual boundary into every role. He would not kiss another woman on screen. Not ever. Not for any project. "These lips are meant for one woman," he has said, without a trace of performance in it. When the creator of Desperate Housewives, Mark Cherry, wanted him for a role opposite Nicolette Sheridan, McDonough disclosed the restriction immediately. Cherry paused for 5 seconds, then said, "All right, I'm just going to have to write better." He did. They had an excellent season. After the Scoundrels firing, McDonough went 2 years with almost no significant work. He lost the house, lost the cars, lost the financial stability he had carefully constructed for Rube and their children. He has spoken openly about dropping to his knees and asking God why he had been abandoned. He had not been abandoned. He had been made to wait. He and Rube now have 5 children. Both are devout Catholics. They pray together. The children travel with them on location. In 2025, McDonough kissed someone on screen for the first time, his wife, Rube, who appeared alongside him in a film called The Last Rodeo. When the clip circulated online, one viewer commented, "The only man with a spine." McDonough would almost certainly say the spine had very little to do with him. 8. Spencer Tracy and Louise Treadwell. This one does not resolve cleanly. It may be the most truthfully complicated story on this list, and it begins with a marriage that, in the conventional sense, ended decades before the story actually does. Spencer Tracy married Louise Treadwell in 1923. They had met in a theater company. They had 2 children, a son, John, who was diagnosed deaf as an infant, and a daughter, Susie. Tracy processed his son's deafness through the lens of a man thoroughly shaped by Catholic guilt, as punishment, as evidence of divine accounting for his own sins. He drank heavily. He had affairs. By the early 1930s, he and Louise had separated, and he took up residence in hotels and rented rooms, engineering a kind of permanent homelessness. And then, in 1942, he met Kathryn Hepburn. They fell into a love that lasted 25 years, until his death in 1967. Everyone in Hollywood understood the arrangement. Nobody addressed it publicly. Tracy never acknowledged Hepburn in any interview on any occasion. Because Tracy never divorced Louise. He was Catholic, and divorce was not a door he was willing to open. He had said once that he would have divorced only if Louise had asked for it. She was Episcopalian, not Catholic, but she never asked. Biographer Christopher Anderson has suggested that Tracy's reasons were tangled together, religious and personal in equal measure. He believed Louise was something close to a saint. He refused to add to whatever pain he had already caused her. In the meantime, Louise Treadwell had done something that quietly eclipsed everything happening around her. She founded the John Tracy Clinic, a nonprofit built on the conviction that deaf children, given the right instruction early enough, could learn to speak and to lip read. Named for her son. Globally influential within years of opening. Families sent her letters from every continent. Tracy, for all his failures as a husband, supported the work publicly and financially without hesitation. At one fundraising event, he told the audience, "I am a star, but there is nothing I have ever done that can equal what Louise has done for deaf children and their parents." He remained, legally, her husband. She remained, legally, his wife. The arrangement was universally understood and never formally explained. Louise Tracy died in 1983, 16 years after he did. The clinic she built still operates. There is a version of this story that renders her a victim. There is another that makes her the most consequential person in it. Both readings are probably accurate. The truth tends to hold more than one thing at once. 9. John Wayne and Pilar Pallete. John Wayne was not Catholic when he married Pilar Pallete in 1954. He became Catholic when he was dying. That arc, long, slow, and ultimately undeniable, says more about Pilar than perhaps any description of her faith ever could. Pilar was a Peruvian actress, devout and unambiguous about it. And she carried that faith into a marriage that Wayne himself later described as the most grounded of his 3 attempts. His previous 2 marriages had not been to Catholic women, and neither had lasted. Pilar attended Mass. She raised their 3 children in the church. And Wayne, the most recognizable icon of Protestant American Stoicism the movies ever manufactured. The embodiment of frontier self-sufficiency, the man whose entire screen mythology rested on needing nothing from anyone, watched his Catholic wife practice a religion that asked for the precise opposite: humility, surrender, the willingness to kneel. He watched for 25 years. In 1979, Wayne was diagnosed with stomach cancer. He had already survived lung cancer in 1964, losing a lung in the process and returning to work as though the universe had simply issued him a warning. This time, there was no returning. In the final days of his life, he converted to Catholicism. The priest who administered last rites confirmed the baptism. Wayne's daughter Aisa, one of the 3 children raised Catholic alongside Pilar, was present and has spoken about the moment publicly. John Wayne died on June 11, 1979, at 72 years old. His granddaughter later became a nun. If you're inclined to follow a thread across generations, there's something worth pausing on there. The man who had built a 40-year screen career on total self-reliance spent his final hours receiving a sacrament in the faith of his children's mother. Pilar had never pressed the point. She had simply shown up every Sunday for a quarter century. Sometimes that is the whole argument.